First, again, some of you have already heard this, but I have to offer my apology because I had not checked over what were the chapters that were scheduled for this evening closely enough when I first put out the general breakdown of how we were going to go about discussing the themes and the particular chapters and readings within those chapters. So instead of what was originally 5, 6, and 7, it was actually chapter 3, 6, and 7. And the reason for that is it is in those 3 chapters in particular where Einstein, from the period of 1919, right after World War I, to the period of 1949, right after World War II and the founding of the State of Israel, that 30-year period that Einstein spends some of his time in writing public and private pronouncements on the issue of anti-Semitism, Zionism, German politics, his own Jewish identity, and the issue of Palestine-Israel. So that's what we're going to look at broadly this evening. And hopefully, if no one has read chapter 3 for tonight, I will try to give a quick overview of it. And then I'm pretty much going to let you all, since I'll be spending more of the time talking about 3, for you to make some commentary on something that you read in chapter 6 or chapter 7. Does that sound as a reasonable way to go tonight?
Sure.
Okay. So chapter 3 is this period basically from 1919 to 1930. And what happens in that period is going to shift Einstein in some ways from being more of a private citizen to being very publicly engaged on the issue of Jewish identity, Zionism, etc. And also, it's going to be a period when Einstein is particularly concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. So he looks at, in the aftermath of World War I, what happens with a lot of displaced Jews from Eastern Europe who are coming into Germany. And they become, like immigrants everywhere, they become the targets of the right wing in Germany, overlaid the racism there, unlike, that practiced by Donald Trump et al. When it comes to looking at immigrants in the United States, that those immigrants from Eastern Europe are also the direct targets of German anti-Semitism. And so Einstein feels compelled to see them as his countrymen. Now, that wouldn't be the case, by the way, for all German Jews. And Einstein, one of the things that you see evident in the writings of Einstein is he does not consider himself an assimilationist. In fact, he's highly critical of people who see themselves as assimilationists, as if their Jewishness will fade somehow into the background. They'll be deracinated characters and they won't have to worry about their Jewish identity. Einstein says, oh no, you're not going to leave that so easily, because the anti-Semites will never allow you to forget who you are in terms of your ethnicity. As part then of Einstein's effort to combat anti-Semitism, to give Jews a sense of self-esteem and self-actualization, he embraces Zionism. Now, as you will have seen, and we'll talk more about this, what kind of Zionism is it? I should ask that of you now. How do you explain what is Einstein's Zionism? If somebody says to you, oh, Einstein was a Zionist and he really wanted the state of Israel to be a, state. Go ahead.
I would say that he did not want, he didn't like political boundaries, and he didn't like the divisions about people, and he felt he couldn't live in a society where people were not allowed to express their opinions, things like that. And so it was very late. I mean, I think there were several people that were trying to convince him to, especially because there was turmoil in the 40s in terms of with partition or no partition, that kind of a thing. And so he was stubborn. He didn't come around until, I don't know, maybe 47. I don't know exactly. I don't remember the exact date. But
when we get to take a look more specifically at the, at the issues in those dates, we'll talk more about that. But I think what I want to make clear now, and what he tried to articulate during this period of the 1920s when he became a spokesperson for Zionism, is his Zionism was essentially what we call cultural Zionism. If you know one of the foremost cultural Zionists was a person by the name of Ahad Ha'am, who saw Zionism in terms of a spiritual empowerment, a sense that this was a way for Jews who felt oppressed to feel a stronger sense of peoplehood. And for Einstein, that meant that he had this square, or had to circle the square in a sense, because he was a diehard opponent of any and every nationalism, particularly German nationalism. On the other hand, he saw the need for a national homeland for Jews, and this is important, I think, because you have to make a distinction, which I always felt is essential to make, between a place which is a homeland for Jews and as opposed to a Jewish state. That's very, very different, which is why he would continue to embrace the idea of, as Martin Buber did, of a binational state, one that Arabs and Jews could live together, which proved to be not particularly easy to do. And part of which, as you see later on, he blames a lot of it on, understandably, on the British. British imperialism was horrific. And by the way, what country was the first country to recognize the state of Israel?
US. The United States? No.
The Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union.
Soviet Union was the first country, as primarily a way of opposing Western imperialism.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So anyhow, so again, looking at how he discusses and embraces Zionism in the 1920s, is he looks at particularly at anti-Semitism and says we have to consider that Zionism is a kind of cultural revitalization that's going to allow the Jewish people, as he says, as a living whole, and that standing shoulder to shoulder with our brethren, we work for a Jewish and human future for our people. So it's interesting that he brings those two together, a Jewish but also a human, meaning humanistic future, which is why he holds so, so tightly to the idea of cultural as opposed to political Zionism. And he makes very clear in this, as anti-Semitism is gaining ground in Germany in the 1920s, he comes right out in his "What I Believe In," his statement, his testament. He says, "I am a Jew and I'm glad to belong to the Jewish people." And he, by the way, he contrasts this. He said, "Jewish faith, I don't want to have anything to do with that." He was essentially anti-religious, but in the same way that Spinoza, was anti-religious. He believed that there was some kind of cosmic force, but he was an agnostic when it came to whether there was a God, or you had to practice a particular kind of religion. So as he says, and this is, I think we are, as Jewish humanists, very simpatico with this idea that we belong to the Jewish people. That's an important part of our identity, not necessarily to the liturgy that fills and threads the Jewish religion, Jewish faith. And as he says, "I am a Jew and glad to be Jewish people, but I don't regard it in any way as chosen." So I like that point too. It's not like the Tevye, sort of complaint. Could you have chosen somebody else? No, it's just the denial of the idea of being chosen. Bruce?
Yeah, the comment I was going to make is, as you were saying, in a way there was empowerment and a sense of protection for the Jewish people. But in addition, as I looked at kind of some of his writings across the chapters, and even in this chapter, he really also, in a way, embraced kind of the contemporary anti-racist concept, that he was very much not only collaborative about people and no one were better than others, but he really, in a way, seemed to fight against, in his thoughts, policies which drove nationalistic hatred from one group to the next.
Yeah, good point. He did not see a hierarchy, even though part of his cultural Zionism would sometimes lend himself to what socialist Zionists often articulated, which is, well, we've made the desert bloom, and we made this country a better country, in terms of developing it. So anyhow, but we'll get to that too. But you're absolutely right. It was definitely an anti-racist position because he saw anti-Semitism, even though he didn't articulate it as such. He saw anti-Semitism as a racism. In other words, there was something irrational about it. There was something that attributed almost what Sartre would talk about, the kind of metaphysics of thinking about this as some kind of superhuman force, as being a Jew. Carolyn, did you have your hand up, or was it Elaine?
Yeah, I did. Although Elaine might have as well. I thought that, I don't know which chapters I read now. I'm really confused, but that's okay. I mean, it wouldn't kill me if I read an extra chapter, believe me. But I also thought that when he talked about Judaism, he said two things that I thought was interesting. He wasn't a nationalist.
Right.
He would have preferred, like, a world government where there were no boundaries.
Right.
Which is kind of utopian and naive in some ways. But he also thought that being Jewish culturally, he talked about immigrants and how they they often brought the best with them to a new country
Mhm.
and contributed greatly to the country. He
Mhm.
also talked about the values of Judaism repeatedly, and those being community values. And so even though he didn't say we were a chosen people, he did talk about things that in a way elevated us.
Yes, in particular, that's a good point, Carolyn. He said it was really about the fact that at the core of this longstanding identification of the Jewish people was the idea of social justice, or we refer to it as tikkun olam, the moral repair of the universe, and it's clear that because of that. In the embrace of that, the embrace of some kind of social of justice, of truth, and of this idea of reason. All of those were what he drew through the Enlightenment, as one of the uh, people who inherited Enlightenment values. He drew that as having a particular Jewish quality, and that's why for him it was important to stand shoulder and shoulder with the Jewish people. On the other hand, as he said, even though he embraced Zionism, cultural Zionism, when he wrote about his first and only visit to Palestine, he was only there once in 1923. He wrote a piece then when he came back, My Impression of Palestine. And what he said is Palestine will not solve the Jewish problem. And of course, just framing it in that way, he is, in a sense, buying into the larger narrative, right? That there is a Jewish problem, just as when W.B. Du Bois took on the idea that there's a Negro problem in the United States. It was really a white problem, but and as well as the Jewish problem was really a Gentile problem. But as he said, Palestine will not solve the Jewish problem, but the revival of Palestine will mean the liberation and the revival of the soul of the Jewish people. And again, that emphasis is from the German, I think is when you understand the German term, it's really not a religious term. It's talking about soul as some kind of ineffable quality of a people. And so that that's part of it. As I said, I use the anthropological term of cultural revitalization, which are movements that happen globally among lots of different oppressed people. To see Black Power as a cultural revitalization movement. And when Martin Luther King agreed with the idea of Black Power, he talked about it as primarily a way of providing dignity and self-esteem, which is what, you see Einstein discussing Zionism being able to do. Elaine. Yeah.
Well, he had a lot of good or some good thoughts, whatever. He certainly is not a diplomat. Was not a diplomat. And in reading his writings, I found him to be a bit condescending, elitist. He uses the phrase a lot, or something like, us intellectuals or, whatever. And I don't hear him. I don't have a sense of him talking about everyday people very much. He talks a lot about because he was a scientist and he
Right.
talked about the, very educated,
Right.
and
Th-
and even when he went to Palestine, and whether it's true or not that the Palestinians did better once the Jews came,
Right.
which he said that their life was improved,
Right.
that, whatever. It's that's his judgment.
Right.
And in today's world, and I understand it was a different world, but in today's world, that's very condescending. It's not very diplomatic.
Yeah.
There's a better way to say that. Now, he did make the point that the Jews and the Palestinians got along as they do today on an individual basis. They get along. If certain fringes would, butt out, so to speak, they get along. So I found him to be very undiplomatic.
Well, let's go back to your point, and maybe Carolyn can address this too, but everybody else might want to talk about it. Look, he obviously, he as a scientist and as a preeminent scientist around the globe, as somebody who's lauded for his intelligence, and as somebody who's primarily based in a university environment and whose primary network is made up of other intellectuals, he does hew towards what could be construed as an elitist position, the same way that W.B. Du Bois, when he talked about the talented 10th, he saw the idea that education was tremendously important. He was, however, willing to, when German universities in the 20s had quota systems, and by the way, Harvard had a quota system in the 1920s, excluding Jews or limiting the number of Jews. So it wasn't just in Germany that Jews faced that kind of anti-Semitism at the highest ranks of universities. But he went ahead and gave classes to some of these Eastern European Jews who couldn't get into the University of Berlin or to Humboldt, to other universities. But yeah, so he is an intellectual. He is somebody who sees the university as a repository of maybe the best in human civilization, which is why he's a great advocate for Hebrew University, for setting up Hebrew University in Jerusalem on Mount Scopus. And yeah, so, but how did other people feel about that? I mean, I take your point, and I think it's absolutely true that he's not diplomatic. but it's interesting that in some ways he's much less abrasive than some others, like Eric Koller, who was another member at I believe in the university in Berlin, was even less diplomatic. But let's.
What happened?
Yeah, Carolyn, you had a point that you
Yeah,
wanted.
I do think that because he was surrounded by intellectuals at the university, that his focus was much more narrow than everyday people, and he had kind of a noblesse oblige attitude towards people. But I also think, just in general, that people, like, he started out as a scientist, but then everybody wanted to know his opinion on everything.
Right.
And being a scientist doesn't make you an authority on everything, but that's how he was treated.
Yeah.
Plus, I do think that people who have usually a singular talent or gift, whatever you want to call it, or intelligence, Picasso they kind of do what they want to do whenever they get ready to do it. And they don't tend to question themselves in other areas. And I think that he was like that. I think he had, in general, his philosophy was of internationalism and no boundaries and be nice to people and we're all equal. But in his practical daily life, he was like, if you look at who was it, Albert Schweitzer? I mean, he was a great humanitarian, but his daughter thought he was a son of a bitch,
Yeah,
you know.
right,
And I think that happens sometimes with people who are great like that.
right, right. I think I can't see who that is. Is that who has a hand?
Sydney.
Oh, Sid. Okay.
Sid and Rosalie, yeah. Hi, yeah, Rosalie and Sid Young, hi.
Okay.
I think that what struck me most about reading these chapters was the different Einstein pre-1933 and post-1933, because it's almost like he's done an epiphany. I mean, he tells you after he leaves Germany and renounces German culture and everything like that, he tells you that he's no longer a pacifist. And
Well,
that,
yeah, I mean, he qualifies it. He's not an absolute pacifist as he
Yeah,
was
a
prior
militant,
to
he's
the
not a
rise.
militant, yeah, he's not a militant pacifist anymore.
Right.
And then he goes on, I think his visit to Palestine was in around that time, right?
1923.
23, okay. And this is before all of the riots and the
Right,
major
1923.
takedowns and this and that. And
Yeah.
that, as he writes later on, he seems to be much more, he doesn't want to talk about a Jewish homeland, but he becomes much more adamant on a haven for Jews in Palestine. Whereas earlier he's been talking about setting up this kind of ideal state, you know, with Jewish intellectuals and culture and this Jewish sense of community. But later on, he seemed, maybe after his contact with Stephen Wise, he becomes much more, much stronger in advocating a homeland for Jews. And though he still won't go that extra mile to say that it should be a Jewish state, he still is very, very hopeful that there can be some merging of the Arab and Jewish interests and you know, a state that'll contain both points of view. He seems to have, like I say, the difference between what he wrote before 1933 and what he wrote after 1933 was to me very, very striking.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think having experienced throughout his lifetime in Germany, you know, anti-Semitism, and particularly threats that cascaded right up to the point when he had to flee the country in 1933. And then remember, as the horrors of fascism become even more evident, you know, after Kristallnacht in 1938, and then the Holocaust. I mean, Einstein never set foot back in Germany after he left in 1933. He never went back to Germany. And more significantly, he believed, and you know, this I wrestle with, he believed that in collective guilt, the collective guilt of the German people. Now, part of that he takes from Jung. He was a great reader of Carl Jung. And it's Jung who I think generates the idea of collective guilt. And you find that in one of the more recent histories of Nazi Germany is Daniel Goldhagen's book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, where he basically says, yep, lots of people were involved. It's not like people didn't know that this was happening. Lots of people participated in the destruction of the Jewish people. So, you know, I think that assigning collective guilt would essentially obliterate the fact that there was a German resistance, that there were these in cities that were previously communist hotbeds like Hamburg. Even though many of the leadership was hauled away, the Nazis still had a hard time getting into the center city because of how red it was. And those places, like in Hamburg, were the seats of what emerged as, I don't know if you ever saw this movie or heard of this thing, the swing kids. There were these young Germans who adopted American jazz, which of course for the Nazis was verboten because it was, black
Decadent.
music, black and Jewish music, right? So there was resistance at both the cultural level and the political level. But yeah, I mean, what Einstein says, and think about this in relationship to the Trump cult, a small group of pathological demagogues was able to capture and exploit the support of a population which is completely uneducated politically. That's what he had to say about Hitler's rise to power. And I think we've got in the midst, I'm not going to make this perfect analogy because it doesn't exist, but we have that kind of demagoguery. We have that kind of uneducated political folk, and particularly listening to Fox News, etc. So, but
Well,
that's,
Fran,
yeah, go ahead, Bruce, let me
also-
ask Bruce and then come back to Elaine, sorry.
okay, sorry, Bruce.
Well, it's okay. No, a comment I was going to make is when we were talking a little bit about how he lived within his intellect and whether it came off as condescending. One of the things I'm curious about is how he dealt with his anger and how he dealt with his anger that he saw around him. And he saw the disparity between his values or his visions and the way humankind tends to be. And I wonder how much of his condescending nature was driven by narcissism and how much of it was driven by anger that he didn't deal with very well.
That's a good point. I think if you look at maybe in Walter Isaacson's book on the biography of Einstein, he might come close to talking a little bit about the emotional life of Einstein. I know often that when from my reading of some of these biographies, one of the things that he dealt with, one of the ways he sublimated it by music. I mean, music was his refuge and music was his passion. And, he would pick up the violin oftentimes when I think he was, when he was particularly upset about something, or he was having a hard time trying to get to a particular scientific problem or dealing with a personal or political issue. I think that's an interesting point. I think you'd have to look at some of the biographies to get a better sense of that. It certainly doesn't come up in these political writings that we're reading. But Elaine, go ahead. You're gonna.
Well, you brought up that collective guilt and that passage or writing about him blaming, the German citizenry, and it did that. That was the most striking writing to me of the readings that we had, and maybe because there is the analogy, and you are the company you keep. I often say. And of course, not all Germans, he didn't get 100% of the vote. Right. And even some of the vote that Hitler got, it was because people were threatened or whatever.
But he never got a majority. He only got 30% of the vote, which was the high point before he was appointed by president, and then the Reichstag fire came along, and then everything else was kind of shut down and forget about having any votes. So we've got 30%ers here now who are trying to shut down the votes.
So,
ways,
but the
yeah.
comment that he made was that shouldn't have been a surprise. He wrote a book about it, he gave speeches about it, etc. And, you know, analogously, we have that same situation. Trump talked, you know, belittled disabled people, said
Yes.
this about Mexican, you know, there's no surprise. He revealed who he is.
Right.
And so there are a lot of analogies, of course, but I do think he didn't say what a lot of people say, and at least that writing, that they knew what was going on. You know, they turned their heads to the concentration camps and stuff like that. I don't recall that being in the writing, but he did say, you're responsible, you followed him, you picked him, he said who he is. And, you know, maybe you thought you were going to change it or it wasn't going to be bad. I've heard that in the current days, but you got what you picked.
Yeah, and I, you know, I think again that sense of he looks at the whole history of how modern Germany, right, starting with Bismarck and the creation of the German state, is so tied in to militarism and nationalism, which is why, remember, he renounces his German citizenship when he's like a 17, 18-year-old and leaves the country. And then is invited to come back in, you know, to become the scientist that he was by Max Planck, and comes into Germany back in 1914, right before World War I, and then has to leave, you know, 20 years later because of the rise of fascism. So, yeah, he understands that the threads of nationalism, militarism, and anti-Semitism are so powerful in German life that they become this definition of what constitutes the German state and the German people, which is why he can assign collective guilt and why he can effectively say, you know, I'm never going back. Yeah, Russ. So, go ahead. Yeah,
Lenore?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Did I get it
Okay.
mixed up?
So I just see, let's see, I'm gonna melt. I don't know if I'm gonna lose my thought with that very distraction. But I just I think I lost my thought right at that dither here. I'll come back.
Yeah. So Carolyn, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I did see the biography of him on television, but that National Geographic did. And
Genius, yeah, the one with
yeah,
Jeffrey Rush
right.
as the older Einstein. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was quite anxietous during that. When it came to his personal life, I mean, I think there was a part of him that I thought was like as intellectual as he was, in reality based in some ways. He seemed very naive to me in other ways. Not that and I think that's why he had such a strong reaction and became, when he was no longer a pacifist. I think that what he was talking about being an internationalist and there being no boundaries, and that's like me wanting to eat bagels and still be skinny. I mean, you know, we all have our dreams of how it could be, but it's not that way. And he doesn't seem aware of those things. Even in his personal life, he didn't. The difference between his, you know, his first wife and his second wife, and the anxiety he experienced and how he dealt with things. I think that's why he has such a strong reaction. And I think I know that as I mean, I think human nature is human nature, but I also know that as Americans, we have a different identity as optimists, as we can do this, we believe in our freedoms, and in strong contrast to the German mentality, which was more militaristic and was more nationalistic. And I think living in America the way he did, he saw that difference more concretely than if he had just moved to like another European country. And I think when he changed because all of a sudden, all those things came crashing in on him.
Mhm.
So I know what I'm trying to say, but I can't quite spit it out in a cogent fashion.
Well, I think you've raised some important points. He obviously he talks about in a number of his essays the distinction between what he considers to be optimism and a way of thinking about a future generated by reason, etc., and pessimism, something that's driven by irrational thoughts, etc., etc. So what you have is he makes that kind of distinction, and certainly he embraces the United States because he feels it gave him refuge. He saw, even though he was very aware of the racism in the United States. He he was he was critical of white supremacy, as you'd expect him to be. But he sees to some extent the U.S. and somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, that little piece that he wrote about,
Right.
through rose-colored glasses. In my family, again, Franklin Roosevelt you had a substitute for God. It was Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
And the thing was that when you looked at Roosevelt's policies, particularly in the State Department, which was run by these Southern bigots,
Right.
they basically prevented more Jews from coming into the country, more Jews from escaping. He was somebody who embraced the idea that Palestine after World War II should be a place, unlike what the British wanted to do with the Peel Amendment, etc., limit the number of Jews who could come in. He said, no, it has to be a Jewish homeland, and you have to open up the gates so more and more could come in. But he didn't, I think he wasn't completely in tune with the inner workings of the Roosevelt administration to understand how awful it was when it came to keeping Jews out of the country, turning back the SS St. Louis, not bombing the rail lines to the death camps. I mean, lots of things that were really problematic about the Roosevelt administration. Yeah, other.
I think,
Go ahead.
so I think also that I was impressed. I mean, Rabbi Wise had huge rallies, but the Jewish community was so, you shouldn't do this. I mean, there were such mixed messages as well.
Right.
So I know about the State Department, but really the Jewish community was not speaking with one clear voice either. And
not only that, you had the Jews in Hollywood. This is amazing. The guys who ran the studios, they were concerned about making sure that their films could get into Nazi Germany. So they played down any attempt to stigmatize Nazi Germany. And there were only a very few films where there was, a clear understanding of how bad Nazi Germany was. So you're right. There were people, and just as in Germany that Einstein was critical of, German assimilationists who believed that, you know, if you just keep things quiet
Right.
and don't speak up, you won't draw attention to yourself. But that's not how Einstein operated in the world. And, you know, and that's how, I mean, one of the reasons that I think humanistic Judaism is such an important movement for me is that it doesn't try to hide under a bushel. It doesn't try to diminish its sense of what are humanistic values as Jews. And it doesn't make, as Einstein did, it doesn't make a, you know, a golden calf out of the state of Israel. So, yeah. So yeah, in these, you know, it's obviously difficult, starting in about 1942, right, when basically, given what was happening in Germany, even the left Zionists, which Ben Gurion was basically, right, said, "Oh no, we're, you know, time for a Jewish state. We got to think about a Jewish state." And Einstein never went there. I mean, he made earlier, you know, he said, "Look, my awareness of the essential nature of Judaism resists the idea of a Jewish state with borders, an army, and a measure of temporal power, and an emergence of what now defines the state of Israel, a narrow nationalism." You know, so he's trying to navigate what is a very difficult position, because he wants to make sure that there is a homeland for Jews, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, the revelations about the Holocaust. But he still holds out the belief, maybe it's utopian, maybe it's overly idealistic, that Jews and Arabs can get along, that it's either the British with their imperial interventions, or it's these muftis with their irrational religion that create all of this division.
He didn't really want armies, you know, he didn't want the countries to be militant. And
no.
so,
Right.
I mean, and so, but he did change when he realized that people have to defend themselves, like Denmark needed to, you know, protect itself.
I mean, there's that letter he writes to somebody in Belgium. I mean, he was attacked by some of the more absolute and militant pacifists for, you know, moving away from that position by basically saying, look, Germany is rearming itself. It's becoming this military monster, and I no longer take the position that you should refuse conscription, because that was his point earlier, that the 2% idea, that if only 2% of the people in each country refused conscription, it would ball up the works.
Yeah.
And you know, and you might get rid of armies. But you know, after the rise of Hitler, you know, Europe had to find ways of defending itself. But ultimately, he still was pacifist minded when he said, look, we've got to get beyond the nation state. You've got to give up sovereignty in order to have an international order, including an international police force, you know, so that you didn't need these individual armies. And he had hoped that the League of Nations, and then he had hoped that the United Nations would be that vehicle, but it never was. It never was. It never quite came there. But it should be pointed out, because, you know, I heard a number of people say, well, you know, this was just really utopian and idealistic. But in the aftermath of World War II, for at least 2 years around the world, including in Germany and France and England, the United States. There was a massive upsurge of a desire for a new international order that would eliminate the kind of militarism and warfare that had happened that was so devastating to millions and millions of people. So there was this moment, and that's where out of which comes the Declaration of Universal Rights in 1948. That's the real representation of those aspirations that I think Einstein discussed, and that comes out of a desire to go beyond what had led to these horrific wars. Yeah, so
There's a
Bruce, go ahead.
As we were talking and as we were thinking about his philosophy, I think about John Lennon's song Imagine,
Yeah.
which in a way kind of captures in a way what his message was.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Imagine no country, imagine no religion.
Right.
By the way, just a little anecdote. Anybody been to Liverpool? If you've been to the airport in Liverpool, right outside the airport, there's a big mural that says, "Above us, only sky." You know, from John Lennon. It's great. I mean, knocked us out when we saw that when we were in Liverpool. Anyhow, yes. Go ahead.
Hopefully, yeah. I found another passage very interesting when he denounces Chamberlain in 1938, where the Chamberlain here is trying to make peace, and
Right.
he who's supposedly the pacifist comes out in no uncertain terms, calls him everything but a fool, and says, "What you trust Hitler? And look at Russia. Look what's happening there between Hitler and Russia, and and what's going to happen to Czechoslovakia." But
Right.
I mean, he is so strong in his denunciation of what we have thought of as a peacemaker, Chamberlain. So I just found that very, very interesting in terms of his own history of pacifism and his own constant writings.
Yeah, it's interesting because the right wing and the neoconservatives still went back to World War II and to Chamberlain and used the term appeasement. And that became, you can't appease Saddam Hussein, you can't appease any of these people, even though there were no weapons of mass destruction. So much for, pacifism now. I mean, it's like Einstein, again, tries to walk that narrow path. He is certainly aware that there's no way you can appease Germany on one hand, and yet he's not. That becomes such a singular case for him, right? That it's that because of his German background, because of how rampant anti-Semitism was, and what the ultimate final solution became, applying anti-Semitic politics to the death camps. I mean, it's why he was, I think, so critical of Chamberlain, and was willing to forego what had been his previous militant pacifism to say, we need to stand up. And significantly signs on, we'll talk more about this next week, signs on to the letter that Leo Szilard, his fellow scientist, Szilard from Hungary, his fellow physicist, sends to Roosevelt saying, look, we think, the Germans are on to something with the possibility of uranium isotopes, and the possibility of making a bomb. And we think the United States should get on the ball and maybe do something about this. Now, again, as we'll see, Einstein was never involved in the Manhattan Project at all. So he really wasn't instrumental in bringing that to fruition, but he certainly did urge, because of his fear of what was happening in Germany, he did urge Roosevelt to begin to make a bomb. But both he and Leo Szilard were absolutely horrified by the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we'll talk more about that 2 weeks from tonight. So just to try to maybe wrap up some of this discussion, I wonder how many of us have Zionist family members or Zionist friends and have problems discussing the state of Israel with them. How do you handle that? How would, what would Einstein say? What would Einstein do? Yeah. Do we want to, Bruce, do you want to say something about that? Or?
I was just saying yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you talk about, how do you give voice to what Einstein was saying about having a Jewish homeland, but not making it into a state, and trying to find a way of mutual, some kind of cooperation, given how horrific the history has been now. I certainly can't talk to members of my family, one of whom's a member of AIPAC. I'm not going to.
Yeah. Well, I was raised a conservative Jew, and so I definitely have changed my outlook. Like, we're all human beings, and nobody does the right thing, including myself. We make mistakes. We're just, even American politics is driving me a little crazy, but
A little, sorry.
a lot, right? I'm a precinct captain.
Nice.
So we're having election, so whatever. Anyways, but I just think that there's a lot of troubles going on, and yeah, so absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just going to say, no, I've had a couple of conversations, and what I try to do is, in the conversation, separate out the tension and the realities of the kind of political forces, which are very extreme in terms of driving decision making.
Right.
Try to explore what is the lived experience of the common person.
Yeah.
Because that's usually a place where, and oftentimes they'll want to go back to the, kind of racist perspective that they see among the Arabs, right, and the violent perspective. But what I'll try to do is listen, but I'll try to at least again return to what might be the lived experience to see if they can at least explore that, because without exploring that, we just focus on the black and white of the issue and not the zone of gray. Yeah,
no, I think it's the one and only time that I've been to Israel, Palestine was back before the first Intifada in 1985, and I was staying also on a kibbutz, on a Hashomer HaTzair, the left-wing kibbutz, and we went into, with a group, we went into Bethlehem, the house of bread, right, Bethlehem, and And we, and the, a couple of people said, well, we're just going to go here and don't try to really interact with the rest of the people, as if there was something,
That's what.
there was wrong with that. And in fact, my wife's sandal broke, so I had to try to find a place where we could fix the sandal, and went and walked to this little shop, this Palestinian who was there, and he spoke English, thank goodness, because I didn't know real Arabic and no amount of Hebrew. But he was wonderful. Talked about his son who was going to Texas Christian University. Obviously, he was probably a Palestinian Christian. And he was just really, really nice. And it occurred to me that these deep-rooted blinders, cultural blinders, have become so ingrained in ways that even those people who are often believed to be, quote, more progressive, can still manifest particular kinds of racism.
Yeah.
I mean, we have it in this country too. We shouldn't forget that. So yeah, I agree that it is the lived experience that makes a lot of sense to try to find a human level of connecting to get beyond what are these, political machinations. Yeah, but go ahead.
Rosalie, yeah, I think though that we have to be careful not to stereotype Zionists also, because there is a tremendous range.
Yes.
I know some people, unfortunately, friends for many, many years, one of them, and turned just rabid Zionists after a family member moved to Israel out of terror for the family member's safety. And I mean, this is a rabid Zionist. I mean, totally irrational, just totally, anything, if you say the weather's bad in Tel Aviv, it suddenly turned to be accused of being anti-Semitic.
Anti-Semitic, yeah, right.
And things like that. And then there are Zionists that are very, very rational and very reasonable and take a stance that, look, Israel was created for one reason only, and it has to be there, and it has to have our unanimous support. And we are the strongest country in the world, and we have to give them our support. And that, young people don't remember the horrors, but it's not going to, there's going to be anti-Semitism that are going to face the young kids today too. It's appeared in every century, and more than every century, and every place in the world. And that you can't, there are people that just think this way, and you have to constantly be vigilant, and Israel has to be supported in every way possible. And I mean, there's that kind of Zionist too. And then there's, and if you look within Israel and you look at the parties that constitute the government, I mean, there's the religious Zionists, and then there's the crazy Zionists, as I call them, the rabid ones. I mean, there's just a whole range of things like that. So I think we have to be too careful not to paint them all with the same brush.
Yeah,
but I want to mention something else about Israel, that we've been to Israel several times. I think Elaine mentioned about the people getting along in Israel, the Arabs and the Jews, and they do. For the most part, the Arabs and the Jews do get along. They are economically interdependent, but they just work together on all kinds of things. And the West Bank is a totally different thing. The settlers communities are totally, totally different. And some of the pockets in some of the Arab cities in the West Bank are very, very different too. But for the most part, these are people who live together, cooperate on lots of things, have a tremendous amount of economic interdependence, and live together.
Yeah, I just wonder now, knowing, and this is always a hard thing to speculate, but if Einstein were alive now, given that history of cultural Zionism which he embraced, what would he think now of the state of Israel.
Well,
I mean,
if you're talking about the government that was led by Netanyahu
yes,
for 12 years,
yeah,
I think he would think very poorly of it, just as many Americans do, and just as many Israelis do.
yeah.
And you know,
But I think, you know, I believe that given the thrust of what he said about his belief in cultural Zionism and the desire not to embrace a narrow nationalism, I think the occupation was something that would, even irrespective of which party was in power, because since 67, Labor's been in power too, right? He would be very upset about that occupation. And
as are many Israelis.
yes, that's true.
It's
But I think, you know, the degree to which more and more Israelis have made their peace with that kind of occupation. And some Israelis have left, family members that I have, right, who have left because they saw the direction that the country was going in. They didn't want to be part of that, even though a number of them had served in the military, you know, as they had to, as people who had made Aliyah. So anyhow, so it's yeah, I think he would be very bothered by what the state of Israel has become as an occupying power. And, you know, he would be also, I think, he would have trouble trying to figure out, just as anybody has trouble trying to figure out, how you develop a modus operandi, how you allow for the expression of the identity of two different people in one geographic region. So
He would also be very troubled by the US.
oh yes,
And,
oh, that goes without saying.
and so much more in Europe and the nationalistic movements in Europe. I think he would be screaming, haven't you learned from World War II?
Yeah, but yeah, I agree. I think on the other hand, he'd probably feel, even during Angela Merkel's reign, I think he might even consider going back to Germany.
Yeah, exactly.
Because in terms of their welcoming Syrian refugees, they had one of the most, far more extensive than here in the United States. They had a much more tolerant position. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't these pockets, as there are, of this extreme right wing party that, you know, is like 10% in the parliament. But we have the other party representing, you know, essentially sadistic politics. I mean, it's just astounding. So, so anyhow,
I have
yeah,
a quick comment. I was thinking that I think he would, on the one hand, he'd be very pleased with the advancement of science,
right,
and education. But on the other hand, if you take his views of toxic masculinity and aggression, and you look at the moral inferiority, oftentimes, of leaders who take power, I think he would be very demoralized, because those have combined throughout the world.
right. I agree. And I think that's an important point about that idea of toxic masculinity and this this belief in this kind of male chauvinism that touts anything that's seen as vulnerable as somehow effeminate, weak, etc. I mean, that's why it astounds me that the media, after Trump made fun of a person who was differently abled, that the media didn't stop altogether showing anything of that, of that bully. But it, he was an attraction that gave them money in terms of, revenue stream, and they continued spotlighting him, giving him an inordinate amount of media attention. And so maybe that's also, CEOs of corporations are known also to have their own pathologies and toxic masculinity, as we well know now from,
Oh my
from
goodness.
yeah. So of Les Moonves and, folks like that, from what's all been revealed. So, yeah. Elaine.
Well, even though I agree with Bruce, he would have been impressed with scientific advancements. He would have been very disappointed with science deniers.
That's right. Yeah, the fact that you can have people who believed the cockamamie ideas about, vaccines, for example, and the denialism that goes into that, and climate denialism.
Climate deniers. I mean, for
I mean,
years,
yeah,
30 years, 40 years, it's been
Yeah.
going on.
I think that's where perhaps some of that elitism would be particularly evident, when he would be critical of people who are incapable of rational thought. And so anyhow.
So he
Yeah.
he has the difficult, because one of the key things, one of the three reasons that he wants to live in a place where you can state your own opinion, but how does he deal with people that he doesn't agree with? Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are ways, obviously, to have civil disagreements. What he finds exasperating, and this will become also evident, 2 weeks from tonight, is when people hang on to an idea like nationalism and see that as a solution to a political problem. That he doesn't see it as a solution, but he sees it as only adding to additional problems, which is one of the reasons why he never actually became politically active in the sense of aligning himself with a party, engaging in day-to-day political struggles. He certainly articulated positions, but he wasn't somebody who was going to get involved in, in a political party and argue over how we're going to compromise around something like climate. Like he would be a little upset with the Democrats that, oh, we're just going to have to get rid of this to satisfy Joe Manchin. Like, are you insane? Why do we have to do this? Because this is such an existential threat to our species now.
As well as in Joe Manchin's state, they're having some major climate issues.
Yeah, sure. Well, anyhow, I want to again thank everybody for a good discussion tonight. And 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be talking about chapters 8, 9, and 10 on World War II, civil liberties, and the world citizenship idea, which he really embraced even more so in the aftermath of World War II. So that's 2 weeks from tonight. And then 2 weeks after that, or a month from tonight, we're actually going to have a discussion of Gary Steingart's new novel, or Country Friends, I think it's called. Gary Steingart is going to be the final speaker for the Jewish Book Fair on November 14th. You can go, there's a link that Jeff has put in the newsletter if you're interested in reading that novel and in hearing Gary Steingart. But that's something we'll be doing because I thought, it lent itself to really getting a chance to hear an author, to read a new novel, and to get back into reading some fiction, which we'll think about in the future also. So any other final comments that anybody wanted to make? Or well, again, thanks everybody for stopping by and for doing the reading and for engaging in the discussion, and hope to see you 2 weeks from tonight.
I just want to say that I really like first person all this original source material that I've never had access to. So thank you.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting way to do some reading that I think, those of us who are historians, we like primary sources. That's
Yeah, exactly.
because we have to use a lot to build, our historical narratives. But yeah, it's not often that we, you spend time doing this much
Right.
attention onto these various topics. But I'm glad people are getting some stuff out of it, and we'll continue with it. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.